Are you afraid to kiss me, Jack?
I'm afraid you'll break my heart.
And steal your heart. You're dear to me as life itself.
Sunshine is my destroyer.
The sun still shines. We can destroy him.
In the mid-1980s, while Hollywood churned out action spectacles and teen comedies, Ridley Scott retreated into ancient forests to craft something boldly different. Fresh from the dystopian worlds of Alien and Blade Runner, Scott embraced pure fantasy with Legend, a film as visually ambitious as it was commercially misunderstood. Picture a realm where sunlight filters through enchanted woods, unicorns roam freely, and darkness waits at the edges. This was Scott's vision, so uncompromisingly visual it seemed to exist beyond narrative itself. As the Lord of Darkness rises from the depths, horns gleaming against crimson skin, Legend announced itself as something far removed from the practical fantasy of its era. With a substantial $24.5 million budget, Legend arrived at a curious moment after the sword and sorcery boom of Conan, before fantasy found footing again with Willow. The result was a disappointing $15.5 million box office that threatened to relegate the film to a footnote in Scott's career. But like the flickering light in the film's darkest moments, Legend refused to be extinguished.
It's very magic.
Really?
Yes, Jack.
What makes this fairy tale continue to captivate viewers decades later? Scott's unwavering commitment to overwhelming atmospheric beauty, a film that prioritized mood and visual splendor over conventional storytelling. In an era where fantasy reached for accessibility, Legend dared to be ethereal, dreamlike, and unabashedly romantic. This isn't just good versus evil. It's a sensory experience where every frame resembles a pre-Raphaelite painting, where darkness seduces rather than threatens, and where even corruption carries a strange beauty. In an industry defined by formula, Legend stands as testament to artistic vision, even when that vision challenges commercial expectations. Join me as we explore Scott's most misunderstood masterpiece, a dark jewel in fantasy cinema that reveals new facets with each viewing. Because sometimes the most enduring stories are those that dare to prioritize visual poetry over narrative convention, creating a dream from which some viewers never truly wish to awaken. Before CGI-dominated fantasy filmmaking, Legend achieved the impossible through sheer craftsmanship. Cinematographer Alex Thompson, who would earn an Oscar nomination for his work here, painted with light in ways that transformed Pinewood Studios' massive soundstage into a living, breathing fairy tale realm. Each beam of sunlight cutting through the forest mist wasn't a digital effect, but a meticulously placed source, creating what Scott called an illuminated darkness. At the heart of the film's technical achievement stands Rob Bottin's creature designs. After his groundbreaking work on The Thing, Bottin crafted over 50 unique beings for Legend, from the delicate forest sprites to the grotesque goblins. But his crowning achievement was Tim Curry's Lord of Darkness, a towering crimson-skinned devil with 8-foot horns that required 5 hours of daily application and weighed so much that Curry could only film for short periods before needing rest. The forest itself represents perhaps the most ambitious practical set of the decade. Rather than shooting on location, Scott insisted on building an entire woodland ecosystem indoors at Pinewood Studios. Real trees were uprooted and replanted alongside artificial ones. Live grass and flowers were maintained under giant arc lights. The controlled environment allowed for Scott's signature smoke-filled cinematography, but created its own problems, most dramatically when a fire broke out during a lunch break, destroying most of the primary set and forcing a costly rebuild. Perhaps the most fascinating technical aspect remains the film's dual identity through its music. Jerry Goldsmith initially composed a sweeping classical score for European release, while American audiences heard a synth-driven soundtrack by Tangerine Dream. These fundamentally different approaches created essentially two versions of the same film. Goldsmith's lush orchestration emphasized the timeless fairy tale qualities, while Tangerine Dream's ethereal electronics pushed the fantasy into something more dreamlike and modern. What emerges from these technical elements isn't just craft for craft's sake, but a complete sensory world. Legend doesn't just show you fantasy, it envelops you in it, creating an atmosphere so thick with detail and mood that narrative almost becomes secondary to the pure visual experience of journeying through Scott's meticulously constructed dream. At its heart, Legend revolves around three pivotal performances that elevate its simple fairy tale structure into something more psychologically complex. A young Tom Cruise, fresh from the success of Risky Business, but not yet the global superstar he would become, brings unexpected vulnerability to Jack, the forest-dwelling innocent. Casting Cruise against type traded his cocky smile for wide-eyed wonder, gave the film a protagonist caught between boy and man, his journey mirroring the film's transition from light to darkness. What's particularly fascinating about Cruise's performance is how it represents a road rarely taken in his career. The physical demands were immense. He performed his own stunts, including a dangerous ice slide, and spent weeks learning to move with the natural grace Scott demanded for Jack's character. "I wanted him to feel like part of the forest," Scott explained. "Someone who's grown up almost feral among the animals." Cruise's willingness to disappear into this ethereal role, before his action persona solidified, offers a glimpse of an alternate career path the actor might have taken toward more experimental work. Mia Sara, in just her second film role, delivers the story's most nuanced performance as Princess Lily. Her corruption sequence remains the film's psychological centerpiece, a mesmerizing dance with her shadow self that explores temptation with startling sensuality for a PG-rated film. "I wasn't playing two different characters," Sara later explained. "I was playing the same girl discovering parts of herself she didn't know existed." Her transformation from innocent princess to dark seductress and back again provides emotional weight to what could have been a one-dimensional role. The casting process for Lily reveals Scott's meticulous approach. After interviewing nearly every young actress in Hollywood, including Jennifer Connelly and Diane Lane, Scott chose Sara for her combination of classical beauty and emotional complexity. Her preparation involved studying ballet for months to achieve the otherworldly grace Scott envisioned. "Ridley wanted Lily to move like she's floating just slightly above the ground," Sara recalled. "This attention to physical performance creates a character who seems to exist between worlds, human enough to relate to, yet magical enough to belong in this fantasy realm." But it's Tim Curry who dominates the film as the Lord of Darkness, buried under pounds of prosthetics that require daily 5:30 a.m. application sessions lasting over 5 hours. Curry somehow delivers a performance of surprising subtlety and unmistakable menace. "I couldn't see anything outside the immediate circle of the set," Curry recalled. "It forced me to concentrate entirely on the moment." His seduction of Lily showcases the film's most compelling dialogue, imbuing evil with an eloquence and philosophical depth rarely seen in fantasy villains of the era. The unicorn hunt that drives the plot functions less as narrative and more as mythic symbol. Innocence pursued, corrupted, and ultimately redeemed. Scott frames these creatures with reverence approaching religious awe. When a unicorn is poisoned by darkness's henchmen, the entire natural world responds. Flowers wither, water freezes, and perpetual night falls. This sequence, with its ice crystals forming in real time through practical effects, represents the film's most technically impressive and emotionally resonant moment, a perfect marriage of visual storytelling and mythological significance. Through these performances and set pieces, Legend transcends its simple good versus evil framework to explore deeper themes of innocence, temptation, and the fragile balance between light and darkness that exists in nature and within ourselves. When Legend premiered in April 1985, critics and audiences alike seemed bewildered by what they'd witnessed. The New York Times dismissed it as a beautiful muddle, while Time magazine called it all picture and no motion. With its truncated 89-minute American version featuring the Tangerine Dream soundtrack, many viewers felt they'd seen something gorgeous but incoherent. The film quickly disappeared from theaters, seemingly destined for obscurity in Ridley Scott's filmography. The initial critical response focused almost exclusively on the film's visual achievements, while lamenting its perceived narrative shortcomings. Roger Ebert, in a 2-star review, wrote, "All of the special effects in the world, and all of the great makeup, and all of the great Muppet creatures can't save a movie that has no clear idea of its own mission and no joy in its own accomplishment." This sentiment echoed throughout most mainstream reviews. Acknowledgement of the film's beauty coupled with frustration at its dreamlike, sometimes disjointed storytelling. What few realized then was that Legend existed in multiple forms. European audiences saw a 94-minute cut with Jerry Goldsmith's orchestral score, while Scott's original vision extended to 125 minutes. Each version offered a substantially different experience, not just in length, but in atmosphere and emotional impact. The Tangerine Dream soundtrack gave American audiences a more contemporary, dreamlike quality, while Goldsmith's score emphasized the timeless, mythic elements Scott had intended. The soundtrack controversy itself became a fascinating subplot in the film's reception. Jerry Goldsmith had composed a majestic, romantic score that perfectly complemented Scott's visual approach. However, after test screenings with younger audiences, Universal Pictures executives pushed for something more contemporary. Enter Tangerine Dream, whose electronic soundscapes fundamentally altered the film's tone. As film music historian Jeff Bond noted, "It's one of the rare instances where you can point to a soundtrack change that transformed not just how a film sounds, but how it feels and what it means." The theatrical marketing campaign further complicated audience expectations. Posters prominently featured Tom Cruise wielding a sword against a backdrop of adventure, while the film itself offered a much more contemplative, visually driven experience. Young audiences expecting an action-packed fantasy in the vein of Conan were instead presented with a methodical, atmospheric fairy tale where visual composition often took precedence over narrative momentum. Over the years, Legend found its audience through home video and late-night television screenings. Fans debated which version was superior, traded bootleg tapes of different cuts, and gradually elevated the film to cult status. The visual references to Jean Cocteau's Beauty and the Beast and the Brothers Grimm tales that casual viewers missed became subjects of passionate discussion among a growing fan base that appreciated the film's artistic ambitions. Fantasy film historian David J. Hogan suggests that Legend suffered primarily from poor timing. It arrived after the sword and sorcery boom had peaked with Conan, but before The Princess Bride showed that fairy tales could be commercially viable again. It was simply too pure a fantasy vision for mid-80s audiences who wanted either action or knowing irony in their genre films. The release of Scott's 114-minute director's cut in 2002 dramatically changed perceptions of the film. Scenes once dismissed as visual indulgence revealed themselves as essential to the story's mythic structure. Moments like Jack's underwater confrontation with swamp hags and extended sequences in Darkness's lair restored the narrative coherence many critics found lacking. With Goldsmith's original score reinstated, the film finally achieved something approaching Scott's original vision. Film critics began reassessing Legend in light of this more complete version. The AV Club's Keith Phipps wrote, "Seen now, Legend looks less like the failure it was branded as upon release, and more like a film ahead of its time. one that dared to take fantasy seriously when the genre was still considered childish escapism. Similarly, Empire Magazine's retrospective review awarded the director's cut 4 stars, noting, "This is the legend Scott intended, mysterious, menacing, and unabashedly romantic." Nearly 4 decades after its release, Legend stands as the last great pre-CGI fantasy epic, a handcrafted world of practical effects, physical sets, and makeup artistry that feels increasingly precious in our digital age. Its influence extends far beyond its initial commercial impact, casting a long shadow over fantasy filmmaking that continues to this day. Guillermo del Toro has repeatedly acknowledged Legend as a formative influence, with the aesthetic DNA of Scott's film clearly visible in Pan's Labyrinth and Hellboy. The creature designs, particularly the majestic horns and crimson skin of darkness, have been referenced and reimagined countless times, from Dave Harbour's Hellboy to Disney's Maleficent. When modern filmmakers seek to create fantasy with genuine visual weight and presence, they often return to the techniques pioneered in Legend. Within Ridley Scott's diverse filmography, Legend occupies a curious position. Often overlooked in discussions dominated by Alien, Blade Runner, and Gladiator, it nonetheless represents his most uncompromising artistic statement, a film where his background as a visual artist and his meticulous attention to atmospheric detail found their purest expression. Scott himself has acknowledged the film represents his most complete vision of a world beyond our own. For contemporary viewers, Legend offers something increasingly rare, fantasy that doesn't explain itself, that trusts in the power of images to convey meaning, and that allows symbols and archetypes to resonate on an almost subconscious level. In an era of exposition-heavy world building, its confidence in visual storytelling feels refreshingly bold. The film assumes a visual literacy many modern fantasies no longer expect from their audience. Perhaps most importantly, Legend reminds us that fantasy at its best isn't about escape, but about confronting fundamental human truths through metaphor and myth. The eternal struggle between light and darkness, innocence and experience, played out on Scott's mist-shrouded sets, speaks to conflicts that remain eternally relevant. When darkness proclaims, "There can be no light without darkness," he articulates the film's central philosophy, that these opposing forces define and need each other, existing in eternal balance. As new generations discover Legend through streaming services and special editions, they find a film that rewards patience and attention, revealing new details and depths with each viewing. In a landscape dominated by franchise filmmaking, its singular vision stands as testament to fantasy's power to create worlds that feel genuinely otherworldly rather than simply familiar stories in exotic settings. What other visually stunning fantasy films deserve a second look? What forgotten gems prioritize atmosphere over conventional plotting? Let me know in the comments below and subscribe to join our journey through cinema's most beautiful and misunderstood masterpieces. Because in a world of disposable entertainment, films like Legend remind us that sometimes true artistic vision requires time to be fully appreciated, and once discovered, becomes impossible to forget.